All right. So I want to talk to you real quickly about word choice, word order, and tone in poetry. So, because poems tend to be considerably shorter than most prose works, the vocabulary choices and the way that those words are used and arranged within the poem are more significant individually than they are in a piece of prose. So, if you take a novel that might have 100,000 um, to upwards of 250,000 words in it, depending on the length, and you compare that to a poem that might be a few lines long, even up to a couple hundred lines long, you'll understand that each word in the poem carries much more of the meaning than the individual words in the novel. So we have to pay particular attention to the individual words used in a poem. The poet pays particular attention to the words that he or she selects, as well as the ordering of those words. And oftentimes a single word can carry multiple meanings, and the placement of the word and the words adjacent to it can affect that meaning. So, the first thing we want to understand is that the general word that we use to describe the vocabulary selections and the way that those words are used within a poem is diction. So we talk about the diction of a poem. And that has largely to do with word choice, but it can also be the arrangement of those words as well. And a lot of times students will think of poetry as having this very flowery, sort of artificial feel to it. And we call that poetic diction. That is diction used specifically to achieve this particular aesthetic idea. And that was really popular in poetry of like the 17th and 18th centuries. It's not as popular anymore. But diction still takes different levels, right? So we have formal diction, we have informal diction, which includes things like colloquialisms, idiom, and dialect. And then we have what's called middle diction, which is your sort of everyday educated person language, right? So what most of us speak on a daily basis. So if we just take a look at some examples of this, one of the poems you're reading is Thomas Hardy's The Convergence of the Twain. And if we just look at one stanza from that, we can see a good example of what formal diction looks like. So Hardy writes, "In a solitude of the sea, deep from human vanity, and the pride of life that planned her, stilly couches she." So, that does not sound like the way a typical person speaks. And if we look at this, there are some words in here that suggest to you this formal level of diction. Solitude, vanity, and in particular, the phrase stilly couches. So, stilly being a very elevated and formal word that simply means quiet or calm, and couch meaning simply to lie. So when he says stilly couches she, means quietly lies or quietly rests she. So we can see there, right, that is highly elevated formal diction. Another thing that we'll see here, and a lot of times this goes with formal diction, but not always, is word order. The syntax here is not what we would typically see, right? This stanza is, these 3 lines, comprised of a single grammatical unit it runs to a period at the end. And if we look at it, it begins with this prepositional phrase, in a solitude of the sea, and then another prepositional phrase, right? Deep from human vanity, and the pride of life that planned her, stilly couches she. So we have an adverb, a verb, and then our noun, which is completely backwards from what we would normally expect in a typical sentence constructed in the English language. Generally, you have subject, then verb. Here we have, and then you would have your prepositional phrases and so forth, right? Here what we have is our prepositional phrases stacked one on top of the other, followed by the verb phrase, followed by the noun. So it's almost completely backwards, right? If you were to write this as a regular sentence, you would say something like, she lies quietly in the sea, deep from human vanity, right? You would do it that way. That would get moved to the front. So that's a good example of word order and how syntax can be rearranged. The question then we ask ourselves when we read a poem like this, or what we should ask ourselves, is why? Why formal diction here, right? Why choose this phrase, stilly couches she? Why rearrange the syntax here? What is achieved through the use of the formal diction and the syntactical arrangement? And if you look at the poem in its totality, you'll be able to see some of what is achieved through this. But even looking just at this one stanza, one of the things that's achieved is the rhyme, right? Sea, vanity, she. And you can't achieve that if you go with less elevated language or with a traditional syntax. If we want to look at something like informal diction, then we can look at another poem that you're reading for this unit, which is Gwendolyn Brooks' We Real Cool. Right, and if you look at Brooks' We Real Cool, she writes not only in an informal level of diction, but actually in dialect. And it is a black or African American dialect, but particularly an urban dialect, right? It's very different than what you would expect maybe from like rural Southern black speech in something like a Faulkner novel or something like that. So it's not just that it's African American, but it's specifically urban. And so when we look at this, very informal, right? We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon, right? It's very informal. There's nothing in here. There's not a word in here that necessarily demands you look it up. There's not a word in here necessarily that feels particularly elevated or out of common usage. And again, the use of dialect, right? We real cool. And so you can see the difference pretty easily. And you can imagine what it would be like if she tried to write this in the tone of something like The Convergence of the Twain. It wouldn't have the same effect at all, right? So those are poetic decisions being made. And we always have to think then about it. What is the level of diction? Why was this chosen? And clearly it's chosen here, along with the dialect, to give a portrait of a particular kind of person. She doesn't have to tell you anything about the pool players at the Golden Shovel. You know it from looking at the language. And so that's why that's there. And if you want to see an example of something that would be more like a middle diction, your sort of common form of educated speech, I think we can look at something like Randall Jarrell's Death of the Bull Turret Gunner, which is something that we're reading. And if you look at that, there's really nothing in here either that suggests a particularly formal language, but it's clearly written in more sort of complete sentences with typical rhythms, and there is a level to the language that it indicates a sort of educated individual, right? So when you read it, it feels like, again, that kind of middle of the road. It's not colloquial, it's not conversational, it's not dialectical, but it's also not artificially elevated. It is just standard sort of educated prose or diction. And the syntax is what we would expect, right? From my mother's sleep I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze 6 miles from earth. Loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. In here also is not only this sort of middle diction, but we get a good look at tone. We think about the 3 poems, and particularly Jarrell with the Death of the Bull Turret Gunner, and Brooks with We Real Cool. And you can hear very clearly tone, which is the attitude of the poet towards the subject. They are the attitude of the speaker on the subject. And what you have here, if you look at the Death of the Bull Turret Gunner, and you see a word like state, it's capitalized here, right? From my mother's sleep I fell into the state. And so the state, capital, suggesting what? The government, the military. So what he's saying is very young, right? Basically, I was a baby in the womb in my mother's sleep, right? And I fell out just right into the Bull Turret Gunner, which is this sort of parallel image of the pregnant belly underneath the bomber. And so he's just emphasizing here, look how young people are being taken and put into this war situation. And the word state, while it's a very neutral word, lends itself very ambiguously to interpretation. But we understand from the context here that it's negative. The state could be positive. But within the context here, the state clearly indicative of something negative. That's reinforced by words like hunched, right, which has this kind of negative connotation to it as well. So you have words that denote, right, the denotation of hunched is just a sort of bent pose, but there's a connotation of hunched here, which suggests something sort of stunted in a cramped space, uncomfortable, right? So it has negative connotations. And all of that lends to the tone. You have black flak, nightmare fighters. Again, so negative. And then this great last line, which has this powerful tone, right? When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. Now, there's a number of ways to read that. I like to read it sort of ironically, in that this is a very sort of nonchalant, impersonal, kind of casual approach to death. that they just wash them out. It's all clean and forgotten, right? It's all just down the drain, next person into the turret. That is negative and depressing, but I read it with a sense of irony. You could read this with a sense of anger, and it's sort of up to you as the reader to determine that. But clearly, it's a line that evokes tone, and that tone is influenced by words like state, hunched, black, and nightmare that come before. And similarly, the tone of something like "We Real Cool" is light and snappy, right? And you can hear it in the voices of the speakers in the poem. We real cool. I mean, it's casual, it's easy, and the repetition of the ideas that they're cool, that they shoot straight, right? Strike straight is the phrase used. That they're drinking gin and they're skipping school. That all has this sort of easy, casual, kind of fun, almost thumbing your nose, right, attitude to it. And if you listen to the audio recording of Brooks reading the poem, she even says as much, right, that they think they're being anti-institutional by going out and do this. Is it actually? Well, maybe not. But for young people, this feels like a real rebellion, that they're going to skip school, go out and do the sort of stereotypical thing that everybody thinks they're going to do, right? It's the idea of the rebellious teen rebelling by doing what every other rebellious teen is doing. It's all kind of in fun, right? But you can hear it in the poem, even to the point where the last line is, "We die soon." It doesn't feel like, oh, they're gonna die, right? It doesn't have that, because of everything that precedes it. You read "We die soon" and think to yourself, like, it doesn't seem to suggest a literal death, right? It seems to imply that that sort of carpe diem sense of seize the day. This is it, right? This is their life to live. Skip school, go out, play pool, drink gin, listen to jazz, have fun. Why? Well, because you're going to be dead soon, i.e., grown up with a job, with responsibilities, and whereas if "we die soon" is at the beginning of the poem, right, or if the language is more formal, then you might get a completely different impression of that. And so this is why the language diction choices are so important. You have to keep in mind specific diction. Is it, first of all, just in general, is it elevated? Is it colloquial? That is it formal or informal? Or is it somewhere in the middle? What does that tell us? Sometimes it tells us something about the speaker's socioeconomic status. Sometimes it tells us something about the speaker's cultural status or associations. It might tell us about their gender. It might tell us about their religion. Right? Diction can tell us all kinds of things. So pay attention to that. Think about important words in the poem, things that stand out to you. What is the denotation of the word, and then what is its connotation within the poem, like we did with something like hunched or state. Look for tone. What is the tone of the poem? Is the speaker being sarcastic? Is the poem angry? Is the poem melancholy? What words contribute to that tone? What about the ordering of the words, the syntax? How does that contribute to the meaning of the poem? All of these things contributing to the meaning of the poem. And as you read, you have to pay attention to them. And it's very difficult to pay attention to all these things at once, which is why I'll continue to emphasize to you, you need to read the poems again and again and again. And if a poem many of the poems I'm giving you are no more than 20 or 30 lines long, and a lot of them might only be 5, 8, 10 lines. You should be able to read them a bunch of times. And as you read them, paying attention, sounds, word order, the way it changes as you read it again and again and again and can anticipate what's coming. And make notes for yourself. If there are words that you are curious about, that you don't understand, or that you think are important, get yourself a marking system. Circle things that need to be looked up. Underline things that seem particularly significant. These are the words that control the poem, right? Put a star next to a line that seems to do something special in terms of establishing tone. Make a note if there's a change in speaker, if there's dialogue or something like that going on, like in the poem Ozymandias by Shelley. You have the poet's persona speaking for about a line and a half, and after that you have the speaker from the antique land relating what he saw, and then within that is an inscription on a plinth. So there are different speakers within the poem, so you want to make notes of those kinds of things. They might have different diction. Two people having a conversation might have different levels of diction. So those are the kinds of things you want to pay attention to, and you really just have to read again and again and again, and it might be helpful to just, when you read the poem the first time, you just want to enjoy it, read it a second time, read it a third time, and then start reading for things in particular. Ask yourself, what is the level of diction? How do I know? Ask yourself, what words have connotations that seem really important beyond their denotations in the poem? Ask yourself, are there words that seem like they're associated to contribute to something? Again, if we go back and look at this reading of the death ball would be cool, the death of the ball turret gunner, where you have words like hunched and dream and black and nightmare, like words that seem like they're associated in some way, right? It's like playing a game like Taboo or $100,000 Pyramid or something like that, where it's word association. Look for those things. And we'll talk about other strategies that you can use. But I just wanted to make sure you understood what we talk about. This covers a lot of the vocabulary in your vocabulary list there, right? So that we understand what we're looking for in terms of diction, word order, syntax, as well as understanding tone.